Let's talk about affirmative action. That phrase from the right is sometimes met with disdain, but on the left, it's met with praise. So which one is more accurate, and does affirmative action really even work? Let's find out. To clarify, in this video, I'm speaking specifically about affirmative action on college campuses, meaning that colleges have policies in which when you're applying to a college, your race can play a factor in whether or not you're going to be admitted. That is what we're talking about. The idea behind affirmative action was try to correct all of the injustices that were done to people of color in the past. In many cases, they were outright denied access to higher education. And so the idea behind affirmative action was to try and fix that. So if the goal was to increase the number of African Americans who went to college, seemingly it has worked. For example, if you look at the college completion rate by race, you can see that among blacks it's increased by quite a bit. Every race has actually increased. If you look at the college enrollment by race, you can see that for African Americans, it's increased quite a bit as well. Now, I don't think it's fair to say that all of these numbers are due to affirmative action, because as we saw, they all increased across the board regardless of race. Nevertheless, you could say it's played a role, and perhaps it has. However, does that mean that the positive benefits outweigh the negative outcomes? Because there certainly are negative outcomes when it comes to affirmative action. For example, large preferences often place students in environments where they can neither learn nor compete effectively, even though these same students would thrive had they gone to less competitive but still quite good schools. We refer to this problem as mismatch, a word that largely explains why, even though blacks are more likely to enter college than are whites with similar backgrounds, they will usually get much lower grades, rank toward the bottom of the class, and far more often drop out. This is the mismatch theory. Now, it doesn't just apply to race, it applies to virtually anything that colleges take into account aside from academics. So if you're a really good athlete and you get into a prestigious university, you may be mismatched with that university. Or let's suppose you're a legacy admission. You may be mismatched with the university. Basically, it means you were admitted to a university, but you're not really as competitive as the rest of the students. You weren't quite qualified enough to get there. Race sometimes plays a role, legacy admission, athletics, there are many instances. But specifically here, we're talking about race. And as he rightfully points out, the African American dropout rate is about 45% in universities, compared to the overall average of 30%. So African Americans are significantly more likely to drop out of college than any other race. To get an idea of what this mismatch theory actually means, consider this example. Let's say that you're in high school and you're in a mediocre class. You don't do excellent, but you're doing pretty good. It's just a general math class. But then the teacher decides to bump you up to an honors or an AP class. All of a sudden, you find yourself in a class with a much more rigorous pace. Now, maybe this inspires you to work harder and you catch up, but maybe you get disincentivized. You can't catch up, you can't do the work, it's too difficult, and so you end up doing even worse than you would have done had you stayed in the original class. That's the basic idea behind mismatch, that affirmative action programs, which are trying to help African Americans, may in fact be placing them at universities they're not actually qualified enough for, and so they're struggling. As an example of this, consider the fact that black law student graduates are 4 times as likely to fail bar exams as whites. And mismatch can account for half of this, according to this author. To try and counter that specific example, we can look at the African American Attorney Network, where they say that 61% of black law students graduate with more than $100,000 in debt, compared to only 40% of white students. As a result, black lawyers may decide to skip bar review courses in favor of working. Their argument here is that African American students who are in law school tend to have higher debt than those who are white. And so as a result, they're probably working more, they have more jobs, and they're not able to study as much or take additional classes, which is certainly a possibility, so let's look at that. If we look at the average debt of graduating law school students by race, we find that Hispanics and African Americans have about $73,000 in debt, whereas white students have $70,000 in debt. There's only a difference of $3,000, which does not seem sufficient to me to explain the 4 times disparity in the bar exam. To give you another example of affirmative action and how race can be used in place of grades or scores, consider medical school acceptance rates. So here you can see that regardless of the score range in these areas, black students were significantly more likely to be admitted to medical school than any other race. Black applicants were more than 9 times more likely to be admitted than Asians, and more than 7 times more likely than whites. As a matter of fact, if we take an Asian student with an MCAT between 30 and 32, he is just as likely to get accepted to medical school as a black student with an MCAT score between 24 and 26. In other words, he scored 6 points better than that black student, but because he is Asian, he has the same likelihood of getting in, even though objectively speaking, he seems to be more qualified. Specifically, let's look at Harvard. There is currently a lawsuit because Asian Americans are claiming that Harvard is discriminated against them using these same practices, something that I tend to actually agree with. If you look at the average SAT scores of students by race, you can see that fairly clearly Asian Americans score the highest and African Americans score the lowest. And if we look at the numerical values, the average SAT of Asian Americans in Harvard is 766, compared to African Americans of just 703. That is a disparity of 63 points, which is a fairly significant number on the SAT. But it gets even worse than that, because Asian Americans tend to be docked points when it comes to their personal interview. Harvard consistently rated Asian American applicants lower on traits like positive personality, likability, courage, kindness, and being widely respected. Asian Americans scored higher than applicants of any other racial or ethnic group on admissions measures like test scores, grades, and extracurricular activities. However, Asian American students' personal ratings significantly drag down their chances of being admitted. So essentially, even though Asian Americans had the best scores, the best grades, the best extracurricular activities, they were consistently rated lower when it came to these personal attributes. Essentially, Harvard is saying that overall, Asian Americans are less likable, less kind, less courageous, all of these attributes, which sounds pretty bad to me. To consider exactly how bad it is, just kind of reverse the roles here. Let's say that African Americans were being rated by Harvard as being consistently unlikable, uncourageous. In their personal interviews, they were being docked points for virtually no reason. That would be racist, and everyone would agree with that. But because it's happening against Asian Americans, and there are already a lot of Asians at Harvard, I guess it's okay. Now, to kind of push back on the mismatch theory, let's look at this article from the Brookings Institute, where the author says there is no credible evidence supporting the mismatch theory, and that the opposite findings prevail. Students are most likely to graduate by attending the most selective institution that will admit them. He's talking about graduation rates. Let's look at those. Specifically, at these very elite institutions, you do find the African American graduation rate is very high. At Harvard, for example, African American students graduate 96% of the time. That is an astronomically high number. And so maybe you look at that and say mismatch theory cannot be true because they're graduating at really high rates. And so they're obviously not mismatched with their college. But there's something else we have to take into account, and that is grade inflation. Because apparently, just like money, grades are inflating and essentially becoming worthless. Let's look at Harvard once again. The median grade in Harvard College is indeed an A-. The most frequently awarded grade in Harvard College is actually a straight A. The most common grade given out in Harvard, the most prestigious university in the world, is an A. You would think that because it is such a good university, it would be really hard and the grades would be a little bit lower. But no, the most common grade is an A. Furthermore, a former president of Harvard said this: 90% of Harvard graduates graduated with honors when I started. Just think about that for 1 second. 90% of those who graduated with honors. At that point, it's almost more of an honor to be in the 10% who doesn't have the honor, because at least then you're unique. 90%! What is going on at that college? Can you imagine graduating high school with a class of 600 and 500 of them are valedictorian? Because that's kind of what's going on here. But it's not just Harvard. It's basically every university. These images show how the average GPA has changed from 1983 to 2013. And as you can see, there's a very clear trend upward. Whether you're at a public school or a private school, the average GPA has increased. What's even more telling is the number of A's that are being given out. And that's what we see here. The percentage of grades that are A used to be below 20 back in 1963. Now, however, it's approaching 50. And this kind of indicates what's happened in that time frame. So basically, we have two different trains of thought. One, either the students we have now in 2020 are just so much better than the ones we had in 1960 or 1990, or two, the colleges themselves have changed and they're more likely to give out higher grades. And personally, I do not think that college students in 2020 are more competent or more intelligent than they were several decades ago. And if you think they are, take 1 second to think about the types of college students that we have on campus right now. Yeah, doesn't look like a pretty picture, does it? So that brings us to the fact that universities themselves have changed. So how does this relate to mismatch theory? Well, if we go back to these very prestigious schools and the fact that African Americans are very likely to graduate from them, it kind of diminishes it when you realize, as we saw, that the most common grade at Harvard is an A. So it seems fairly easy to graduate once you get into Harvard. Now, I'm not trying to say these elite institutions are easy, because I don't believe that's the case. However, objectively speaking, it does seem easier to get an A now than it did 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. So even though African Americans may be graduating at these very high rates, that does not mean they're prepared for what's coming next. which is why, as we saw in the bar exam, they were 4 times more likely to fail. They may have graduated college and law school, but if they weren't as qualified or as prepared, then they failed the bar exam once they saw the real world. So overall, while affirmative action may have some positive benefits, it certainly has many negative outcomes, including discriminating against Asian Americans and perhaps setting up African Americans to fail in a wood that they wouldn't had they gone to a different school. But that is just my opinion. After going through all of this data and all of this information, what do you think? What are your thoughts on affirmative action? Let me know down in the comment section below. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, all those good things. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.